is Johnnie Lotesta. I'm a postdoctoral fellow at the Ash Center for Democratic Governance and Innovation, and I'll be moderating our discussion today. I want to start with a few announcements on the Ash Center's behalf. First, the Ash Center would like to acknowledge the land on which Harvard sits as the traditional territory of the Massachusetts people and a place which has long served as a site of meeting and exchange among nations. Second, this event is being recorded and the video will be made publicly available on the Ash Center YouTube channel after our event has concluded. And third, we will dedicate the last 15 to 20 minutes of our time together today to respond to your questions. And we encourage you to submit your questions at any time. Please be sure to do this using the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen, as opposed to the chat feature. This will allow us to more effectively monitor your questions and moderate the discussion. So now I'd like to briefly introduce today's speakers. We are joined by 5 panelists representing organizations from the gun violence prevention, immigration, labor, and environmental movements. We have Greg Jackson, who is National Advocacy Director for Community Justice Action Fund, which is a nonprofit organization focused on building power for and with communities of color to end gun violence. Greg has public service experience with the DC Office of Neighborhood Safety and Engagement, as well as campaign experience being the former field director for the Democratic Congressional Campaign Committee. Our second panelist is Graysa Martinez-Rosas. She is Executive Director of United We Dream, which is the largest immigrant youth-led movement in the United States. Originally from Hidalgo, Mexico, Graysa immigrated to the US with her family at a young age and grew up in Dallas, Texas. In her 8 years as staff at United We Dream, she has held the roles of Civic Engagement Field Manager, National Field Coordinator, Advocacy and Policy Director, and Deputy Executive Director. And now serving as the full-time executive director. From the US labor movement, we are joined by Mr. Damon A. Silvers. Damon is the Director of Policy and Special Counsel for the American Federation of Labor and Council of Industrial Organizations. This is popularly known as the AFL-CIO, a voluntary federation of 56 national and international labor unions representing 12.5 million working people. Prior to joining the AFL-CIO in 1997, Damon worked for the Harvard Union of Clerical and Technical Workers, the Amalgamated Clothing and Textile Workers Union, and as a law clerk at the Delaware Court of Chancery for Chancellor William T. Allen, as well as Vice Chancellor Barnard Balak. And last but of course not least, we have Matt Davis. Matt is Vice President of Civic Engagement at the League of Conservation Voters. The League of Conservation Voters is a national advocacy organization with 32 state affiliates, and it fights for climate action and a fair, equitable democracy. Matt, in particular, oversees the League's pro-democracy and nonpartisan mobilization work. All right, so now with those introductions complete, I'd like to turn to a few prepared questions that my co-organizer, Tova Wang, also a fellow at the Democracy Center, and I have for our panelists today. First, a question for Graysa. The first DREAM Act was introduced in 2001. And as you know, Graysa, every version of that bill introduced to date has failed in Congress. How do you feel about the prospects for immigration reform under the Biden administration, and how is United We Dream organizing for this change?
Well, first I want to say good afternoon, everyone. My name is Graysa Martinez-Rosas. I use she, her, ella pronouns. My friends and homies call me G. And I am really honored to lead and represent the nation's largest immigrant youth-led network with more than 1 million members across the country, and doing so as an undocumented, unafraid, queer, and unashamed woman of color. I think your question is important, and I think what I will add is that when we think about, in the context of this conversation about social movements, there is a deep connection with obviously the DREAM Act and on the policy end, but that definition of success for us at United We Dream and the movement wide has been actually the growth and expansion, the political, the cultural, the community power that has been expansive in the last 10 years, of which the policy has been one piece of the puzzle. I'll say that, I remember being in the Senate gallery in 2010. I was a senior in college. I was, to be honest, I just wanted to have papers and like go and use my degree as I wanted to go and be a doctor. And I just thought, I just show up to Washington, D.C. I saw that video about how a bill becomes a law. Like, I feel like I just show up, tell my story. We'll be done. I'll get back to my finals and, I'll have papers. And unfortunately, as I said in the Senate gallery, after spending months of lobbying, of visits, of actions outside of the Senate office, I remember as a daughter of a Southern Baptist preacher, I was just so overcome with joy and fascination that our movement had like a wall of Jericho sort of like swarming around the Senate and saying like we need to deliver citizenship for millions of people. And what we saw in the Senate place in that time was a failure of our democracy. We lost by 5 votes at the same day that the passage of LGBTQ rights legislatively happened in that same day, in that same vote. And as a queer woman, being able to be torn with the celebration of an advancement, one part of me, and the total absence of justice when it came to immigration reform. And so in this moment, we have survived not only the last 10 years, but the last 35 years without policy or political advancement by any part of the Democrats or Republicans. And so I am very clear and very ready to win citizenship. And I know that we'll be able to do that this year. Our movement is stronger than ever. The political and cultural power is behind us. And I think that Democrats understand that without a victory on immigration, a 2022 and a 2024 elections look really bleak for us.
Thank you for that, Grace, and thank you especially for sharing your reflections on that moment and the emotions that you felt fighting for justice for your community and that experience of being in Congress at that time. That's really insightful. Thank you. So my next question, or our next question, is for Matt. We saw the Trump administration roll back a number of environmental regulations during its tenure, and this fueled quite a bit of protest and mobilization activity among climate activists in the United States. And now we see that President Biden is making some big moves, including climate initiatives and a number of his spending proposals and jobs proposals. But are these moves enough? How close does it come to meeting the environmental movement's demands? What are LCF and other climate groups organizing for under the Biden administration? And how does LCF understand the prospects for environmental policy change? And I'm sorry, I misspoke. LCV, League of Conservation Voters, is the group I'm referring to. Matt.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Johnnie, and thank you to the Ash Center for having me today. It's a great question. It's an important question, and there's no denying that the Trump administration was an unmitigated disaster in many ways, but particularly on the environment. And the Biden administration thus far has shown the strongest first day for climate and environmental justice we've seen from a president before. Full stop. And there've been a number of ways in which we've seen progress. The first that I want to highlight is just the personnel that has been installed in key positions across government. We saw over the last 4 years in the Trump administration, people that did not deserve to be anywhere near some of the jobs they had relating to the environment. And so, key positions with Deb Haaland in the Interior, Jennifer Granholm in Energy, Michael Regan in the EPA. These are key government posts that are going to have significant influence in what happens in this country related to environmental policy moving forward. We saw some key executive actions day one, and in that first week related to rejoining the Paris Climate Agreement, ending the Keystone Pipeline, rolling back some of the really damaging regulations that the Trump administration had laid out, ending drilling in the Arctic. Those were really critical steps to reverse some of the damage that had happened. And then, we saw the American Rescue Plan pass. And, when we look at the environmental movement, it's not just about polar bears in the Arctic or just public lands. It's about people. And, the American Rescue Plan provided critical support to the communities, largely BIPOC communities that are most impacted by environmental degradation, to provide key economic relief that was needed. And so we were very supportive of that. And as we shift to the future, beyond those personnel and executive actions that's taken place, we're looking to additional legislation that's critically needed. And obviously that takes Congress too. And so it's going to be a challenging conversation. It's going to be a lot of negotiations. And in terms of whether, the question sort of framed up, is it enough? No, what the Biden administration has done is not enough. It requires legislative action. We need we need more. And so the American Jobs Plan that's been put forth by the Biden administration is, a critical part of that. And I think one thing that's, relevant to whether there's going to be an environmental bill is that we may not see one environmental bill, right? This is the environmental bill and everybody's going to focus on this and it will have climate, environmental justice. It's likely going to be weaved into a lot of these other big conversations that are happening. The infrastructure package is one of those and has some very key elements that will put the U.S. on a path to 100% carbon-free energy grid by 2035. It centers racial justice and equity in acting on the Justice 40 promise that the president made about 40% of the funds going to climate justice communities specifically, and harnessing and protecting our public land. So very critical components in that bill. That is a big focus of our organization and the environmental community right now. But one thing I just wanted to note is that, I'd be remiss if I didn't talk about democracy, because we cannot win on our, goals related to climate, environmental justice if we don't have a functioning democracy. And so LCV and other organizations within the environmental movement have really centered the HR 1, We the People Act, For the People Act, rather, the Voting Rights Advancement Act, DC statehood. These are some really critical, bills that we need in order to have a functioning democracy that properly represents the communities of color who've been systematically disenfranchised from elections since the founding of this country. Those are the communities most impacted by climate change. If we don't have a system that represents their voice, we're never going to be able to win to the extent that we need to. So we're putting a lot into democracy, and we continue to put effort into state-based wins too, because the federal work is really important, but there's a lot happening with the environment and democracy on the state level. With that, I'll kick it back to you, Johnnie.
Thank you for that, Matt. And I really appreciate that you brought up that connection between democracy work and advocating for specific types of policy changes. I certainly read all of the movements that you represent as playing a role in both of those things, despite the different issues that you might be organizing around. And I'd love to talk about that more towards the end of our conversation today. So now I have a question for Greg. Greg, on April 7th, President Biden and Vice President Harris announced executive actions to address gun violence as a public health epidemic. These actions included directing 5 federal agencies to prioritize and fund community violence prevention and interventional efforts in communities across the country. The administration's proposed jobs plan also includes $5 billion over 8 years to support community violence prevention programs. These feel like monumental wins. And our question to you is, we're wondering if you can put these executive actions into context for us. How big of a change is this? And can you describe the work that went into getting us to this point. And I would also like to create space for you, if there's other big things that you'd like to see from this administration in terms of moving this work forward.
Yes, definitely. Thank you. Thanks again for having me. These measures are monumental. And for me, it was extremely personal, how impactful this was. I'm a survivor of gun violence, and I was shot on April 21st of 2013. And when I was in the hospital watching political coverage of the issue of gun violence, this was 3 days after Congress failed to act on the background checks bill. And we saw Congress totally neglect gun violence as a crisis that needed any type of political or policy response. And since then, we've seen over 100,000 people either being shot or killed by gun violence every year. And so for me, since 2013, and when I was shot to now, that's nearly 800,000 people who have been impacted by this violence directly. Secondly, we've seen that over the years, the only thing that our American government has responded to violence in our communities with has been this law and order, law enforcement only, criminal justice, increased sentencing, policing approach, which frankly has failed. We've seen cities that have increased their law and order strategies and tactics and budgets. Cities that have now budgets of 50-60% of their city budgets are pouring into law enforcement and policing tactics, but they're still seeing violence increase. And there's a real reason for that. The reason that gun violence is so common and unfortunately surging is because the problem is not the criminal activity that's connected to the violence. It's the risk factors that lead to violence, especially in Black communities. I think one big misconception is that violence in inner city communities is connected to some big criminal structure or activity, when in reality, especially in the Black community, Black homicides, 68% are not connected to any other crime. So literally these incidents are moments of passion, a response to trauma or challenges, or frankly, crimes of desperation, but not necessarily connected to a long lineage of other criminal activity. And so at the Community Justice Action Fund, we saw this a long time ago, and I saw this from a hospital bed, that the way that we were going about it was wrong. We're overlooking the root causes that lead to violence, the risk factors that are rampant in neighborhoods that are most impacted by violence. And really, we started to shine a light on government's failure to address economic inequality, education inequality, housing instability, everything that fuels this cycle of violence. So we've been advocating for looking at this for what it is, a public health crisis. And every major public health crisis has been responded to with a public health response, which includes policy, which includes accountability to those who are fueling the violence, but it also includes resources for prevention tactics and methods and intervention strategies. So that's been our message. And we've seen cities and states start to react to it, but we've gotten zero traction at the federal level until the Biden administration. We were very thankful that Biden, even in his campaign, committed $900 million to invest in public health and community-based solutions to address violence before it happens. And day one, when he entered office, we were on that line like, hey, we heard what you said, but what does that really look like and what more can be done? And we started to just really paint this picture of the parallel between this public health crisis and other public health crisis. I think the most common one that folks are aware of is the opioid crisis, which Donald Trump paid $9 billion in investing in public health solutions to the opioid crisis. So we started to paint that narrative to the Biden administration that if you truly believe this is a public health crisis, what type of resources are you going to invest in these community-based solutions? And frankly, they responded. I think first there was a little bit of hesitancy, like, okay, well, how much? So then we did the math on what is violence costing America. And there's an organization called the National Institute for Criminal Justice Reform, which has done a lot of data on this. And they found that every year our economy suffers by $280 billion. That's how many dollars we lose per year. And so for me, since I was shot, and since 2013, that's $1.9 trillion that have been lost in our economy. And so that was kind of the foundation of like, look, this is what you're losing. So investing in saving lives is a smart return on your investment. And so we started with, okay, what are the major cities that you think we can start with? We looked at 48 cities and we mapped out what is the impact of violence in those specific areas and what is the cost of these community violence programs and how they can be resourced adequately to help turn the tide on violence. And so we came up with $5 billion, $5.36 billion. But we also pointed to other programs that are close to addressing violence, but have not been tweaked to be eligible to include these public health solutions. And so on April 8th, the president actually signed legislation to make adjustments to those 26 programs to make sure that they include violence prevention and intervention strategies, programs that support survivors of gun violence as they're seeking trauma support or therapy, programs that do conflict resolution before law enforcement arrive, and programs that focus on those who are most at risk of being a victim or potentially an offender of violence, and provides wraparound social services for them. So that was the first big step. A couple other major things you spoke of, he included that $5 billion in the American Jobs Plan, pointing to the fiscal cost of gun violence and how it impacts our economy and our workforce, which is a very real correlation. So that was huge. And then just yesterday, the Department of Treasury rolled out guidance around the American Rescue Plan dollars and that $350 billion that were given to states, and noted that this should not just go to healthcare resources, but also programs and tactics that address the health disparities that have intensified the death toll around the COVID-19. And they pointed directly to programs like community violence intervention programs, which have been directly correlated. So that was huge as well. And so we're going to continue to push on that. Right now, we know that these programs work. In certain cities, we've seen violence reduce of upwards of 80% when you actually invest in these public health community-based solutions to address violence. But in every city and every major state, these programs are underfunded, under-resourced, and overworked. And so we're going to continue to advocate, but we're just really, really excited that Biden is starting to signal and lead and make real adjustments to open doors for these public health solutions. But now we're looking to Congress to basically to act around that, because while Biden is making adjustments to existing programs, there still isn't authorized funding that is specifically focused on these strategies. And so we do need dollars to specifically focus on these areas so that someone that's doing survivor support for a gun violence victim is not competing with someone who's doing survivor support for a domestic violence victim, for example. And right now, that's kind of what's happening based on the tweaks that that Biden has made. And no one should have to make that choice. And so we're advocating for that $5 billion to specifically focus on this population, and demanding Congress and the Senate step up and pass legislation to authorize these new funds. So I say all that to say we're just really excited. Biden is looking at this beyond just the gun control, hardware, supply side of the crisis of gun violence, but also looking at what are the public health impacts, what are the risk factors, and what is leading to the demand of firearms that unfortunately is costing lives in our country. So we're really proud of that. This is a very monumental moment for our movement, and hopefully we have the leadership in place to turn the tide on this crisis. So thank you.
Thank you, Greg. I mean, that is so informative, and I really appreciate how you both brought your personal story into the context of this conversation and also drew these connections with public health crises. It seems to me to be a very important and interesting centering of the core root causes of this issue. And thank you for narrating the process by which, that the amount of money to invest in these programs was developed, and the work that you're doing to advocate to Congress to allocate more funds and approve these funds for use across the country. We did have a quick question in the chat about the report that you referenced, Greg. I think it was it the National Institute of Criminal Justice Reform?
Yes, yep, that's it. And also Giffords Courage, they have similar reports around that. And then there's also the Violence Policy Center. When I quoted kind of the data around crime and its interaction with gun violence in Black and Brown communities, the Violence Policy Center does an annual report where they just track homicides, frankly, and what are the stories behind them. And if you watch the media, you would think every crime, every gun-related homicide is this big criminal, connected to some big drug deal. But when you actually look at the stories, it's not that way at all. It's actually a minority of the situations are connected to other criminal activity. And that kind of illuminates how we've been going about this wrong for so long. And so we're excited. We've been making that case, and we're excited to see the Biden administration lack onto it. I see that you want me to respond to the question in the chat real quick?
Well, let's turn to Damon, and I have some questions for the group, but I'd love to continue this during the Q&A if folks have more specific questions. So thank you for that, Greg. So for Damon from the AFL-CIO, the 2010s were a difficult time for organized labor in the United States. We saw the proliferation of right-to-work laws across key labor strongholds like Michigan and Wisconsin, as well as the Janus versus AFSCME Supreme Court decision, which ruled union security agreements unconstitutional for all public employees. And for our listeners, union security agreements are a way of making sure that unions are able to collect service fees from all members that they represent and whom they provide legal coverage to. And I'm sure that Damon can provide clarification on that for us if people have clarifying questions. So our question for Damon to start off is, we're wondering how you, Damon, assess labor's prospects under the new administration, and what are the big items that the AFL-CIO hopes to achieve in the next 4 years?
All right, great. Thank you, Johnnie. And it's a pleasure to be with everybody. I really enjoyed and benefited from the other panelists' remarks. I forgot to say, I'm Damon Silvers. I go by he and him, and people call me Damon. Let me, and I want to tell a couple of little stories first, and then I will answer your question, Johnnie. That sort of sort of how I got here and what motivates, and I think they shed a little bit of light on your question, actually. My first job in the labor movement, as you said, was working for the Harvard Union of Clerical and Technical Workers, which represents the people who I'm sure did something to make this event possible, the sports staff at Harvard University. I came as somebody sort of committed to social and economic justice within the community that had educated me at Harvard. I came to work for the union as a junior staffer. And I was told a story when I got there that really changed the way I thought about a lot of things by people who were working at Harvard. And they told this story that at that time in the 80s, Harvard faculty offices were, there were sort of administrative support offices surrounded by Harvard faculty offices. And this may still be true. I don't know, I haven't been there in a little while. And that students would routinely come to these spaces and look around and see that the faculty doors were all closed, and say to the people sitting there in the center who were doing the work, "Oh, I guess there's nobody here. I'll come back later." And we run our economy and our society as if there's nobody here. Right, as if the people who do the work aren't there. The challenge, what the labor movement is about, is the insistence on the part of the people who do the work in our country that we are in fact here. And the second little story I'll tell, because it goes directly to what we're dealing with right now in terms of the Biden administration and in terms of what the labor movement and working people are trying to achieve, is that my second job in the labor movement was working for a union that now has merged many times and doesn't exist independently because of policy decisions made in Washington about the direction of the U.S. economy, the clothing and textile workers. And I was involved in an organizing campaign at a large textile mill in North Carolina. And on election day, when the workers were voting whether or not to have a union, the company thought that the union was going to win the election. It was a big election, 6,000 people. And it was going to have a serious effect on North Carolina if the union won. And so what the company did on election day was, at the instruction of their lawyers, they had the supervisors walk down the line of textile mill looms in the mill. They walked down the mill and they picked out every sixth person and they fired them on election day. They fired 150 people randomly on election day. The reason why they did that is the same reason that Stalin used to have people shot randomly. That's how you terrorize people. The company did that, flagrant violation of the law. Nothing ever happened to any of the people who did that. They were not fined. They were certainly not put in jail. Nothing happened. 10 years later, multiple elections later, those workers got their union 5 years before their boss closed the mill and moved to China. Now that's kind of what our labor implementation thinks. That's how we run our economy, and that's how we treat the people who do the work. Now, where has that led us? We have now the opportunity to pass really profoundly transformative labor law changes that will truly empower working people and empower, and the data is very clear. If you create real opportunities for collective bargaining for working people across the economy in every job, the benefits flow disproportionately to the people who make up the majority of the working class in this country, who are women and people of color. That the numbers in terms of income gains from collective bargaining show that there's clearly disproportionate gains that flow to people who have been disproportionately disempowered before. The legislation that is on the table is called the PRO Act, and it fundamentally would change U.S. labor law in a whole bunch of ways. It would make right to work, which you were talking about, Johnnie, illegal. It would make it possible. It would make it illegal to fire people for going on strike, restore the right to strike in this country, which is a fundamental human right that's been essentially not honored in this country. It would make the election process for forming a union much easier, and it would create real penalties for doing what that textile company did. The PRO Act would be transformative in American society, and it would shore up, in our view, it would shore up American democracy, which is teetering, frankly. And it is a fitting pair with the voting rights bill that Matt talked about with H.R. 1 in terms of what we need to restore the strength of our democracy, because our democracy is in danger every day that a large part of our working population feels that they're just always the losers in whatever happens in our government. The challenge, and I think it's a challenge that, and let me just say, President Biden has supported the PRO Act vigorously. And really the Biden administration's support for working people and working people's rights is extraordinary. It is different in kind from the policies and political stances of prior administrations, both Democratic and Republican administrations since 1980. It is really different. I think other people have spoken about, how pleased they've been with the Biden administration's commitment to social justice. I just can't say enough good things about their commitment to working people. But the challenge that we face, and we all face it, all of us on this panel, the challenge that we face is that there is at least a decent possibility of a working majority in both houses of Congress to move the transformative legislation that all of us want, that the Biden administration supports. Right? But the current Senate rules do not allow that legislation to move forward by a simple majority vote. Right? And that's true of everything that's been discussed here. It's true of meaningful climate policy. It's true of anything having to do with guns and violence. It's true of immigrant rights legislation, and it's true for voting rights legislation, for H.R. 1. None of these things are going to move none of these things can move through reconciliation as that's currently being interpreted by the Senate parliamentarian. And there is not going to be 60 votes for any of it. So it can't move under the current filibuster rules. And we need to both, and there was a question that posed in the chat there. How do we think about the grassroots? We need to both have a unified approach as people care about social and economic justice to the change that we need to see happen. And there's different ways that changes could be done, but it's all the same outcome. The change that we need to see happen in terms of Senate procedures to enact the kind of legislation that can stabilize our democracy and our economy. We need to do that, and we also need to really have a whole different level of dedication to grassroots organizing here, and particularly to grassroots organizing in areas of the country that are not, shall we say, profoundly progressive on the surface. So for the AFL-CIO, in trying to move really significant labor law reform and to support the fight for democracy, for immigrant rights and a path to citizenship for the undocumented, for all those fights, for voting rights, we've done a couple of sort of really profound and different things for us. We have recruited an army of union member activists in our goal is in every local union in the country, but currently we've got about 7 coordinators in each local union dedicated to doing that. We've built under COVID virtual phone banking structures, postcard structures of union members who are elected officials organized in networks. Our purpose is to be able to truly, and structures of allied relationships. Our purpose is to be able to move senators and congresspeople across the whole country in support of President Biden's agenda. And I would finally say that, and at the moment, you know, the fight is not on the coast, right? The fight is in West Virginia, where we moved Senator Manchin to support the PRO Act. The fight is in Arizona, where both senators' positions are unclear on many of the issues we all care about. The fight is in Alaska, where Lisa Murkowski, a Republican, is a potential supporter of many positive things. The fight is in Virginia, where Senator Warner has been, I think, unclear as to where he stands on workers' rights. These people are all movable, but they're only movable if we really build that grassroots fight. And so I'll just close, Johnnie, by saying that we have to do this together. We have to make the changes in the Senate procedures together, and we have to have some level of broad unity in the progressive community around issues that are intertwined. It can't be separated. Voting rights, people's rights at work, climate change, good jobs. These issues can't be addressed separately. They are in many ways one set of questions about which way our country's going to go. And so for that reason, I think this has been really this is, and hopefully will be for the next half hour or so, a really, really important and positive dialogue.
Thank you for that, Damon, and for highlighting the intersections of all these movements. I mean, it is a critical issue, and a big part of the reason that we wanted to have a panel that sparked conversation cross-movement and not, 4 separate panels with multiple folks from each of your movements, although those would also be very interesting and I'm sure generative webinars. So I do want to save time for audience questions and answers. Before we turn to that, I'd like to take just about 5 minutes to discuss a theme that I'm hearing emerging from our current conversation. And that is this question of the grassroots. And if I may expand upon that, this question of grassroots democracy. All of you are involved in organizations and indeed movements that have mass bases. And all of you have alluded to the importance of engaging communities, of building movements from the ground up, of increasing people's civic and political rights, of incorporation into the polity, such that we become more robust socially and more inclusive socially. And so that leads me into my next question, which is that advocating for policy change inside the White House and on Capitol Hill can involve, as you all know, different skill sets and tactics than building this sort of mass-based social movement of which you all are a part. And from my experience, sometimes those goals can feel like they're at odds. So my question to each of you is, how does your organization balance these commitments or perhaps integrate them in the course of your work? And if it's okay, we'll just start back in order. And if maybe you each could speak for about 30 seconds to a minute on this point, and then I just to leave time to open it for broader discussion. So we'll start with Gracia.
Thanks for that question. I'll say a couple of things. The first thing is that One of the many lessons that I've learned as a grassroots organizer is that access doesn't equal power, and that though part of the power and the influence that, for example, someone like the AFL-CIO and Damon, the power comes, as he was saying, from the working class people and like all of the members that are part of the unions. In the same way that all of our organizations, and that the power that United We Dream really leverages is one grounded in the million members that make up our network. And so a great reminder and a history of United We Dream is being able to play what we call the inside outside game, and being really clear that at the end of the day, politicians are folks that we have elected, that the people have elected to drive a collective agenda that ensures that the lives of not only undocumented people, but working class people, especially Black people in this country, are advanced. And so as we think about this administration, you know, I just want to be very clear. The Trump administration was led by white supremacists. And the fact that that administration normalized a lot of like the policies, the way in which they treated civil society in this country, as well as the role that big businesses had and big corporations had in shaping the policy agenda, it will be up to us, people that are folks that are directly impacted, that are representative of millions of people across the country, to be able to reclaim the halls of Congress, to be able to reclaim the White House. And in conversations with the administration, it's been really clear that all of us are working towards undoing the damage and the harm that our country has seen in the last 4 years. Finally, I'll say is that, you know, in the wake of this moment, it's gonna be really important to ensure that we take into consideration the role that systemic racism, in particular, the impact that this both the confluence of the pandemic, of the rise of deaths of Black and brown people in the streets, as well as the role that undocumented people, care workers, are people that picked our food in the farms, people that ensured that our children had like the access to care that they needed, that as we reclaim these conversations and we're in negotiations to make things possible with administrations and folks that care and see the issues that we champion, that it's going to be important for us to maintain the discipline of two things: the discipline of ensuring that every advocacy meeting, that every space that we're in is really grounded in a class race analysis that centers those that has been the most marginalized, including undocumented people. We're celebrating a lot of things, and ensuring that a marker of success is ensuring that undocumented people have access to COVID relief, that we have access to the same worker rights that every person in this country has, as well as being able to benefit from the gun violence prevention laws that are in this place. And the second thing I'll say, and the second discipline that I know United We Dream embodies and we push forward, is this discipline of hope. That though sometimes change is slow, it is not the speed that any one of us in this panel would want to see it. It is coming. And you know, I'm talking to you today from Mexico. It's been 23 years since I've been here. I came to reunite with my father that was deported 15 years ago. And the fact that I'm able to be here and to have the promise that when I go back and jump on a plane, that I'll be able to be welcomed into the United States, a country that I have helped shaped, and a country that I have given my commitment in life to, is because of movement and because of negotiations with the White House, with immigrant young people, leading a clear demand that we wanted to stop deportations, and defending the DACA program, Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals, against the Supreme Court and against the attacks of the Trump administration. It means that the fact that I'm here is that elections have real consequences, that in a Trump administration, it would not be likely that I'll be able to be welcomed back into the US after visiting my father, or that I would be even here to care for him as he's sick. And so I think that as we think about the negotiation spaces between movements, grassroots advocacy and advocacy in the Hill, that we really stay grounded in both the discipline of the vision and the policy victories that we need moving forward that have real impact in everyday people's lives, and the discipline of hope that though change sometimes feels slow, it always comes. And the gratitude that I have for the grassroots organizers before me and the ones that will come after me to make even more things possible.
Thank you for that, Gracia. And I'm so pleased to hear that you are able to be in Mexico to care for your father, and that you will also be able to return. It is so important that, in my opinion, that folks can feel welcome and appreciated. So thank you for your work. So let's popcorn over to Matt. So again, we're talking about this balance between perhaps facing advocacy and this question of building a broader, inclusive, strong social movement.
Yeah, I'll just add a couple quick thoughts because I think Grace has summed it up so beautifully. But I really do believe strongly that organizations with people power behind them, movements with people power that show up to have these, inside the beltway conversations, lobbying conversations, have more power. I mean, these lawmakers do care about, when there are large quantities of people that are supporting movements. And so I think there's a lot of power in that, a lot of power for organizations that have that behind them. I will add, and I think you've seen it show up with my fellow panelists in the stories that they've been telling. Storytelling is critically important in connecting complex policy with real people. And so the ability of grassroots organizers and community advocates to tell their stories and create connections for lawmakers that don't always spend as much time in the community is so important, and I think really helps drive change.
Thank you for that, Matt. Let's popcorn over to Greg.
Yeah, I think the only thing I would add, because the other panelists covered a lot of it, is that we've also seen that our grassroots communities advocacy efforts at the local level has been really important to kind of bubble up the importance. Like we always hear this thing that we need the ideas and innovative ways that we're fighting to address gun violence needs to be socialized, right? And that members of Congress need to know about it and not just hear it from folks in DC, but hear it from their own district and hear it from their own community and their own leaders. And so that's been a huge thing that we've tried to operationalize, especially around the demand for funding. Is in the top 48 cities that we're advocating for, what type of grassroots coalition is there demanding the same amount of funding? What is the city doing so that when there is federal funding, the city is matching it, or the infrastructure at the city level can take those funds and get it adequately to the right programs? And so our grassroots side of our effort is extremely important for socializing it, but also a lot of the efforts that we've seen come to fruition at the White House and the congressional level is a result of what's been done in a specific city and how they've kind of done something in a very innovative way that's impactful. And so I think Grace has said that, the inside outside game is exactly what we play. There's a whole group of folks. We have a federal coalition called the Invest in Us Coalition of about 40 organizations that are hitting pressure points in Congress. And then in every major city, we have similar coalitions that are pushing up to make sure that a member of Congress cannot escape the demand and the need for change. And I'll never forget, President L.B. Johnson said, that's a great idea and they'll make me do it. He told that to Reverend Martin Luther King Jr. So we take that same mentality that we know our ideas are good and we can put it in front of folks, but until the community makes them do it, it's just a simple idea on the table. And so just having that strategy is really critical to being successful.
Yes, thank you for that, Greg. And I appreciate you sharing that term socialization. I had not heard it used in that way before, and I that gives a really nice visual of the work that you're trying to do. So let's popcorn it over to Damon, and then we'll open it up for broader questions.
Thanks, Johnny. Look, I just want to repeat what everybody said here, which is that you want to make real major policy change, you got to have mass mobilization first. It doesn't happen, right? There are very powerful forces that are going to stop you otherwise, right? If it's just a bunch of lobbyists, you're going to get rolled. And I'll just tell you a story from the last couple of weeks that just illustrates this. So we had six target senators, 5 Democrats and Senator Murkowski, who had not co-sponsored the PRO Act, the labor law reform bill, as of a month ago, that we felt as a labor movement probably should be co-sponsoring it. There are people who had benefited from working people's support in their elections. There are people who claimed that they cared about working people, and yet they hadn't showed up. In Maine, one of these senators was Angus King in Maine, who was an independent, caucuses with the Democrats. And he had his objections and all that kind of stuff. One of the largest workplaces in Maine, the Maine Hospital Center in Portland, the nurses were organizing to form a union, right? And in that organizing drive, they mobilized in all kinds of ways and they drew on all kinds of support. And they lifted up the fact that under the current laws, they were being essentially psychologically brutalized by their employer to try to get them not to vote. And that their employer had brought in anti-union lawyers from out of state and given them preferential access to COVID vaccines over the nurses who were caring for the patients in Maine. Now, that whole situation moved Angus King. Angus King co-sponsored the PRO Act. It's clear he did so not because some union lobbyist in Washington asked him to, but because he saw thousands of nurses in Maine illustrating what was wrong with the labor laws. In another way, May Day was just a few days ago. May Day is the International Workers' Day. Its origin is here in the United States with immigrant workers protesting for an 8-hour day 150 years ago. It's been embraced now and adopted by today's immigrant working class in the United States. On May Day, 4,000 people marched in San Francisco for labor law reform and for immigration reform. They commemorated a similar march in 1934 that was part of a mass strike movement that gave birth to the first genuine workers' rights bills in the United States. Those original labor laws didn't come from nowhere. They came from a mass movement. We need more of a mass movement now for everything we're talking about. And we need some level of unity. That's the only way to make real change.
Thank you for that. Wow, I'm learning so much from all of you, and this is so encouraging and insightful. And I could just be on here all day, but I know that we have folks in the audience who have questions. So with that, I will turn it over to my friend and colleague, the brilliant and formidable Tova Wang, who, as I mentioned, is also a fellow at the Ash Center for Democratic Governance and Innovation, and she'll be moderating our Q&A in the moments we have left together.
So I actually did pay her to introduce me that way. So there's a couple of questions in here that I'm going to lump a little bit together, and something I've been thinking about too, which is now you have the Biden administration, and I think that there's been a concern among many who have been fighting for some of this stuff that now that you don't have the villain of Trump to direct protest movement at, how do you sustain the movements to have the same kind of energy that they've had over the last few years in their resistance to keep the pressure on? And one follow-up question that I really appreciate from someone in the audience is, a lot of people who were involved in those movements and did all this stuff during the Trump years are burned out. And I know that Johnnie and I have heard in our project as well, just a lot of burnout. And how do you keep people going after they're just like, okay, I got through those years, and now let's just, give me some breathing room.
I'll get started. I'll say 3 things. The first is that when we have a movement that is centered and grounded on those that are directly impacted, those that, like as some of the civil rights ancestors would say, would feel these issues in their bones, then the work of ensuring that our organizing, our advocacy, and our power building is really grounded from a people-centered, trauma-informed space. And that is one of the things that at United We Dream we have pioneered over the years, because a lot of our work is led by those that are directly impacted, those who have come across deportations in their own families, and part of the way in which we thrived under the Trump administration is to ensure that we were reclaiming health and wellness within our infrastructure and our organizing theory of change, that we ensured that there was, that we grew like the what we call the endocu-health and endocu-healing spaces that are grounded in indigenous practices as we think about the fight ahead. And the second thing I'll say is that, you know, I have a teacher, her name is Norma Wong, and she talks about the long arc of the work. And it's the 7 generations before me and the 7 generations ahead of me. And I do not despair, and I believe that though the last 4 years have been really difficult and we're definitely activating for millions of people across the country, they were also not only a reflection or a result of one man, which is Donald Trump. It was a result of systemic decades and centuries of harm and pain for Black and Brown people, for undocumented folks that have been excluded from victories as we've seen in the past. And so I think that though Donald Trump was helpful and unifying, there's no doubt about that we are standing in the long arc of a mass-based social movement that is only getting stronger. It was in the summer, not only in a reaction to Donald Trump, but in the summer when millions of people went out to the streets in demand for the defense of Black lives and dignity, that it was because there was a systemic response to what all we have been seeing. And so I think it was one of the largest social movements or social mobilizations in the US history. And I think that's just the beginning. I think that you see the movement for Black lives really like digging into ensuring that we're moving forward. The way in which the folks, the young people in March for Our Lives came out and like led the biggest demonstration against gun violence was not only because of a result of Donald Trump, but like a fierce urgency of being able to protect themselves and their family. And I think that the third thing I'll say to the question is that in order for us to ensure that those that are burnt out, because that's a real thing, it's not something to be rejected or to be glossed over, that it is imperative for youth-led organizations and any organizations to invest in young people in the development of training and ensuring that like young people are not only in the streets and door knocking, but that are at the center of decision making, because not only is that ensuring that our movement remains vibrant and there is a lot of institutional memory, but then more and more people are joining us. And so I believe that our movement is magnetic, that there are many millions more that are just waiting for us to give them a call for them to join us, and that we're just getting started.
Did anyone else want to address that?
Yeah, I mean, Tova, I think we're close to out of time, but I think it's really important to understand that, yes, we've been through a dark time, but now we are not in that dark time, right? Now is a moment of extraordinary opportunity. And that's not to say that people who feel burnout shouldn't, take a day off, but that as a nation, as a movement, as a people, we need to understand that our time is now. Right? This is not a terrible moment. This is a moment of great opportunity. And I think there's one thing that really people need to hold in their heads that is contrary to what you read in the papers every day. And it's really important to give people a sense of possibility here. And that is the following fact. The United States Senate runs on majority vote. The United States Constitution says that. You look it up. The Senate does not run on 60 votes. It runs on 50 plus 1. It's only a question of whether those 50 plus 1 actually want to do things. Right? The rest of it is just a smokescreen. Right? We just saw that in President Biden's American Rescue Plan. $2 trillion of help for working people, for communities of color, for our cities. $2 trillion passed by 51 votes. Right? We can do everything that everybody on this call wants to do with 51 votes. We just need them to mean it. That is why this is a moment. And the fact that I believe President Biden, Vice President Harris, the team they have around them, I don't talk to the president, but I've talked to a lot of them. And I believe that they actually learned something from what happened in the Trump administration. And they believe that we need to make profound change in this country, and then we need to do it now. Right? We just need 50 plus 1 to actually do it. Not to talk, but to actually do it. And we can win that. We have the strength to do it. This is a moment of great possibility. It is not a moment for despair or for getting tired. It's a moment to act, to move now.
First I'm going to join Johnnie in thanking everyone before we close out. This has been spectacular and inspiring, and I think it was great to have you all together to also learn from each other about what's going on and maybe open some avenues. I just want to ask Matt and Greg if you had anything, final words that you wanted to add before we have to break away.
No, I wanted to thank everybody, and Grace and Damon, like, they reinforced the opportunity that we have right now. I've been in borderline shock at how much movement has happened in such a short amount of time. You know, I've been an advocate for this issue for 8 years now, and we've made more movement in the last 6 months than I would argue the 8 years combined. And that is something that it doesn't discredit the 8 years. I think all of that built towards this moment. But now that we've gotten here and that opportunity is here, we need to be running on all cylinders. And, you know, for folks who are burnt out or discouraged or just tired, especially with issues like ours, you know, every day we're losing lives to this crisis. And if we need any example for urgency, especially in the gun violence space, you could just turn on the TV and see our lives literally being lost, our youth, our mothers, our fathers, our cousins, our friends, our neighbors. And if we just keep the people who are most impacted and most at risk at the center of our thinking and not get caught up in CNN and MSNBC and Fox News and what this person said and that person said, but just focus on who needs this change. That's kind of been the energy and fuel that we've been riding on. And frankly, mountains are moving right now. And so hopefully we can continue to push forward. There's so many crises that I think we're all working on. And sometimes it's hard to say, well, we don't see an end in sight. But if you think back to American history, there have been so many crises that America has been through, and some group of leaders changed that. And I think the people on these calls are definitely some of the folks who are changing that. And whatever issue that you're fighting for, like, don't underestimate your ability to change that. So I'm excited to see this, and I'm determined that my grandchildren are not going to see the same America that I've seen. But I know that's going to take some work for me, and I think from all of us. So thank you. Thanks for letting me be a part of this too, and kind of amplify our work. And just really excited to connect with the other panelists. So thank y'all.
Yeah, Tova, I just want to thank you all as well. I don't think I have too many additional things to add. It was summed up great by the other panelists.
Okay, great. Well, Johnnie, you want to close us out?
Yeah, so I'll just conclude by thanking you all for joining us today, and of course for the very important work that you are doing to build robust social movements and to advocate for legislation that will create an environmentally sound and inclusive United States for us, and one where we have economic democracy. So I am really looking forward to see the change that's going to come, and thank you so much for